December 7, 1941. While the world watched Japanese carrier aircraft rain destruction on Pearl Harbor, another weapon slipped beneath the Pacific's surface, one that would become Japan's most lethal killing machine and simultaneously its greatest graveyard. The Imperial Japanese Navy deployed 174 submarines during World War II. Only 16 would survive. This is the story of the secret order that condemned 91% of submarine crews to death, not from enemy action alone, but from a doctrine so inflexible it turned underwater warriors into sacrificial pawns in a war already lost. January 15, 1942. 0430 hours. The waters off Truk Lagoon, Caroline Islands. Commander Kanji Matsumura stood in the control room of Submarine I-68, studying Operational Directive No. 47 that had arrived via coded transmission just 3 hours earlier. The document, stamped with the seal of Combined Fleet Headquarters, would fundamentally define Japanese submarine warfare for the entire Pacific conflict. What it contained was not a tactical manual but a death sentence dressed in the language of naval honor. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the war with the world's most technologically advanced submarine fleet. The Type B submarines, the I-class boats that formed the backbone of the submarine force, displaced 2,600 tons surfaced and could cruise 14,000 nautical miles at 16 knots. They carried 17 torpedoes, mounted a 5.5-inch deck gun, and some variants carried reconnaissance seaplanes in waterproof hangars. By every measurable standard, they outclassed American fleet submarines of 1941. But technology means nothing without doctrine, and Japanese submarine doctrine had been forged in a fundamentally different understanding of naval warfare than their American adversaries would employ. Vice Admiral Teruhisa Komatsu, commanding the 6th Fleet, the submarine force, had received his strategic guidance directly from Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself. The submarines would not hunt merchant shipping. They would not strangle enemy supply lines. They would serve as scouts and strike weapons for the combined fleet, targeting enemy warships in support of the decisive battle that Japanese naval planning had anticipated since 1905. This single strategic decision, documented in Combined Fleet Operational Directive 47 and reinforced throughout the war, would doom Japan's submarine force more effectively than any enemy weapon. The mathematics were straightforward but ignored. Japan, an island nation almost entirely dependent on imported resources, would fight a war across the largest ocean on Earth against an enemy whose industrial capacity dwarfed its own. American merchant tonnage in the Pacific in December 1941 totaled approximately 4.7 million tons. Japanese submarines, assigned to fleet operations, would largely ignore this target while American submarines would systematically destroy Japan's own merchant fleet of 6 million tons. Commander Matsumura understood the tactical implications even if he could not question strategic doctrine. His orders directed I-68 to patrol approaches to enemy naval bases, to report fleet movements, and to engage only major warships, carriers, battleships, cruisers. Merchant vessels, unless in direct support of invasion operations, were to be ignored as beneath the dignity of imperial submarine warfare. The submarine force had been organized for this mission. The 6th Fleet comprised 6 submarine squadrons, each containing multiple divisions. 1st Submarine Squadron operated from Kwajalein, 2nd from Truk, 3rd from Penang after 1942, with others distributed across Japan's expanding Pacific Empire. Each squadron received identical strategic guidance: support the surface fleet, scout for major naval operations, attack enemy capital ships. What Japanese naval planners failed to calculate was that American naval doctrine, forged in different strategic circumstances, would employ submarines as commerce raiders. While I-68 waited off Midway for American carriers that would destroy 4 Japanese carriers in June 1942, American submarines were already stalking Japanese tankers and cargo vessels, beginning the strangulation that would ultimately starve Japan's war machine. The technical sophistication of Japanese submarines made the strategic failure more tragic. The Type B boats carried acoustic torpedoes before American submarines received similar weapons. The Type C submarines, the I-16 through I-20 class, carried miniature submarines in deck hangars, enabling special operations. The massive I-400 class submarines, conceived in 1942, would displace 5,700 tons and carry 3 attack aircraft, the largest submarines built until the nuclear age. But all this technology served a flawed strategy. Lieutenant Commander Makitsura Hashimoto, commanding I-58, later wrote in his memoir that submarine commanders received explicit instructions that merchant shipping was not worthy targets for imperial submarines unless military necessity demanded. This attitude, embedded in pre-war training and reinforced by operational directives throughout the conflict, would persist even as Japan's shipping lanes ran red with the blood of a dying empire. March 23, 1943. 18:15 hours. The approaches to Rabaul, New Britain. Submarine I-17 settled to 280 feet, seeking the thermal layer that might hide her from American destroyers circling above. Lieutenant Susumu Kitamura, the executive officer, counted depth charges through the hull's agonizing creaks. 17 so far. The Americans had learned. Japanese submarine construction, for all its technical advancement, contained fatal vulnerabilities that American anti-submarine warfare would exploit with devastating efficiency. The whole design, optimized for surface speed to keep pace with the combined fleet, sacrificed the crush depth that might have saved crews during depth charge attacks. American fleet submarines could safely dive to 400 feet with emergency capabilities to 600 feet. Japanese I-class boats began experiencing hull failures at depths exceeding 330 feet. The riveted construction, rather than welded, created points of failure under sustained pressure. The I-17's hull popped and groaned at 280 feet, each rivet a potential weak point where seawater could begin the fatal intrusion. The crew waited in silence, breathing slowly to conserve oxygen, while American destroyers above maintained methodical search patterns. This scene, documented in dozens of patrol reports recovered after the war, repeated itself hundreds of times across the Pacific. Japanese submarines, designed for offensive fleet operations in favorable conditions, found themselves hunted by an enemy that had industrialized anti-submarine warfare. The United States Navy's development of anti-submarine doctrine proceeded with the same systematic efficiency that characterized American industrial warfare. By March 1943, destroyer escorts equipped with improved sonar, ahead-throwing weapons like Hedgehog, and aerial coordination from escort carriers had transformed submarine hunting from art to science. Statistics documented by the U.S. Navy's Anti-Submarine Warfare Operations Research Group revealed the deadly mathematics. In 1942, depth charge attacks sank an average of 1 Japanese submarine per 140 attacks. By 1943, that ratio had improved to 1 per 85 attacks. By 1944, 1 per 40 attacks. American anti-submarine forces were learning faster than Japanese submarines could adapt. The Japanese submarine force lacked the command structure to disseminate lessons learned. While American submarines returned from patrol to rigorous debriefings where tactics were analyzed and distributed fleet-wide, Japanese patrol reports often went unread at combined fleet headquarters, which remained focused on surface fleet operations. Captain Takeo Mori, operations officer for 6th Fleet in 1943, documented in his post-war interrogation that submarine patrol reports received minimal analysis at headquarters level. There was no systematic effort to identify American anti-submarine tactics or develop countermeasures. Each submarine went to sea essentially learning from its own experience, if it survived long enough to gain experience. The Type C submarines, the most numerous class with 47 boats constructed, demonstrated the vulnerability. These 2,200-ton boats carried 20 torpedoes and had excellent range, but their riveted hulls and limited dive depth made them vulnerable to the increasingly sophisticated American anti-submarine forces. I-26, under Commander Minoru Yokota, demonstrated both the capability and vulnerability of Japanese submarines. On December 20, 1941, she torpedoed and damaged the battleship USS West Virginia at Pearl Harbor. On January 11, 1942, she sank the American aircraft carrier USS Saratoga off Fiji, demonstrating what Japanese submarines could achieve against major warships. But I-20 SIX's success proved exceptional, not typical. Most Japanese submarines would spend the war in fruitless patrols, seeking fleet engagements that rarely materialized while avoiding the merchant shipping that American submarines were systematically destroying. The human cost began accumulating. Each Japanese submarine carried a crew of approximately 95 men in the I-class boats, 100 in the larger I-400 class. These crews came from the most technically trained personnel in the Japanese Navy: electricians, torpedo specialists, engine mechanics, communications experts. Every submarine lost represented not just a weapons platform but the death of an entire community of highly trained specialists. Lieutenant Zenji Orita, one of the few submarine commanders to survive the war, described the psychological burden in his memoir. "We knew the Americans were destroying our merchant fleet. We could hear their submarines operating in shipping lanes we were forbidden to patrol. We requested permission to engage them, to protect our supply ships. Permission was always denied. Our mission was to sink American carriers, even as Japanese cargo ships burned within sight of our periscopes." This strategic paralysis, the refusal to adapt doctrine even as evidence of its failure mounted, characterized Japanese submarine operations throughout the war. While American submarines were sinking an average of 5 Japanese merchant ships per patrol by 1944, Japanese submarines continued their largely fruitless hunt for American capital ships. July 8, 1943. 0320 hours. South of Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Submarine I-11 surfaced to charge batteries, a nightly ritual that represented the most vulnerable moment for any submarine. On the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Shunsaku Nabeshima scanned the horizon through binoculars, searching for the silhouette of enemy ships against the star-filled tropical sky. The radar warning receiver, a crude device installed just 3 weeks earlier, remained silent. Japanese radar technology lagged American development by approximately 2 years, a gap that would prove fatal for submarines that depended on stealth for survival. At 0322 hours, an American PBY Catalina flying boat, equipped with ASV, air-to-surface vessel, radar and operating from Espiritu Santo, detected I-11's surface signature from 18 miles away. The submarine's crew had no warning until the patrol plane's searchlight pinned them like an insect on display. The attack lasted 90 seconds. 4 depth charges, released in a perfect straddle pattern, crushed I-11's pressure hull at frame 47. The submarine sank in less than 3 minutes. 88 men died without time to understand what had killed them. This engagement, documented in U.S. Navy patrol records, exemplified the technological gap that transformed Japanese submarines from hunters into prey. While American submarines received radar warning receivers in 1942, Japanese submarines operated largely blind to electronic detection until mid-1943, and even then with equipment inferior to American capabilities. The introduction of Allied air power to anti-submarine warfare represented perhaps the most devastating development for Japanese submarines. American and Australian patrol aircraft, operating from island bases across the Pacific, created interlocking zones of aerial surveillance that made surface transit increasingly deadly. Statistics compiled by the U.S. Navy's Air Anti-Submarine Development Unit documented the transformation. In 1942, aircraft sank 7 Japanese submarines. In 1943, that number rose to 23. By 1944, aerial attacks accounted for over 40% of Japanese submarine losses. The Japanese submarine force had no effective counter. Their submarines lacked adequate anti-aircraft armament. Most carried only 2 25mm automatic weapons, ineffective against attacking aircraft. American submarines, by contrast, received increasingly heavy anti-aircraft batteries, some carrying up to 5 40mm and multiple 20mm weapons by 1944. Commander Yasuo Fujimori, operations officer at Combined Fleet Headquarters, documented in post-war interrogation that requests from submarine squadron commanders for improved anti-aircraft weapons received low priority. The surface fleet required all available anti-aircraft guns, he testified. Submarines were expected to dive when attacked from the air. This solution worked in 1942 when submarines could dive in approximately 40 seconds. By 1943, Allied patrol aircraft could complete an attack run in under 30 seconds from initial detection. Submarines caught surfacing or diving became easy targets. The losses mounted with mechanical precision. I-7, sunk by aircraft on June 22, 1943. I-24, destroyed by aerial depth charges July 10, 1943. I-19, despite having torpedoed 3 Allied ships including the carrier USS Wasp, caught surfacing and sunk by aircraft on November 25, 1943. Each loss followed a pattern documented in Allied patrol reports: radar detection, approach under cover of darkness or clouds, illumination by searchlight, depth charge attack before submarine could dive to safety. The Japanese submarine force was being systematically hunted to extinction by an enemy that could see them when they remained blind. The communication lag compounded the tactical disaster. Japanese submarines operated under strict radio silence except for critical tactical reports. This security measure, designed to prevent Allied radio direction finding, meant that lessons learned by one submarine could not be shared with the rest of the fleet. I-34, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Nagahide Yanagihara, developed tactics for evading aerial attack in late 1943, including crash diving procedures that reduced dive time to 33 seconds. These procedures, documented in I-34's patrol report, could have saved other submarines. But the report remained at 6th Fleet Headquarters, never distributed to the submarine force. I-34 was herself sunk by aircraft on November 13, 1943, taking Commander Yanagihara and his innovations to the bottom with her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. November 19, 1943. 1,340 hours. Eastern approaches to the Philippine Sea. Commander Ryanosuke Ariazumi stood on the bridge of I-8, watching through his binoculars as a fully loaded tanker, Japanese flag painted prominently on its hull, limped northward toward Formosa, trailing oil and listing 7 degrees to port. The vessel had clearly suffered torpedo damage, likely from an American submarine operating in the Luzon Strait. His orders, received that morning via encrypted transmission from 6th Fleet Headquarters, were explicit: proceed to patrol station off Ulithi Atoll, maintain surveillance for American carrier task forces, engage only capital ships. The tanker, despite flying the flag of his own nation and clearly in distress, fell outside his operational parameters. I-8 submerged and continued toward her assigned patrol area. The tanker sank 6 hours later. 43 crew members drowned. The cargo, 6,800 tons of crude oil desperately needed by Japanese industry, settled to the bottom of the Philippine Sea. This incident, documented in both I-8's patrol log and Japanese merchant shipping records, exemplified the strategic blindness that would prove more destructive to Japan than any American weapon. While Japanese submarines ignored their own merchant fleet's destruction, American submarines were executing the most successful commerce warfare campaign in naval history. The statistical evidence was overwhelming, even in 1943. United States submarines had sunk 296 Japanese merchant vessels totaling 1.5 million tons in 1942 alone. By November 1943, that figure had risen to 1,800 vessels totaling over 3 million tons. Japanese industry, dependent on imported resources, was being systematically strangled. Yet Japanese submarine doctrine remained unchanged. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Miwa, who assumed command of the 6th Fleet in September 1943, received proposals from multiple submarine squadron commanders requesting authorization to attack enemy merchant shipping and to protect Japanese supply lines. Each request was denied. Captain Toshitake Ueno, commanding Submarine Squadron 7, submitted a detailed analysis in October 1943 demonstrating that Japanese submarines could interdict American supply lines to Australia and forward bases while simultaneously protecting Japanese merchant routes. His proposal included specific patrol zones, estimated tonnage that could be destroyed, and calculations showing how commerce warfare could extend the war and force favorable peace negotiations. The response from Combined Fleet Headquarters, documented in 6th Fleet records recovered after the war, rejected the proposal in 2 sentences: submarine force will maintain fleet support operations. Commerce warfare is not consistent with Imperial Navy doctrine. This doctrinal rigidity existed despite clear evidence that Japan was losing the war of logistics. By late 1943, fuel oil imports had dropped 40% from 1941 levels. Bauxite imports, essential for aircraft production, had fallen by 35%. Rice imports from Southeast Asia, necessary to feed the civilian population, had decreased by half. Lieutenant Commander Tatsunoko Ariazumi, no relation to Commander Ryanosuke Ariazumi of I-8, served as operations analyst at Navy Ministry in Tokyo during 1943. In post-war testimony to American interrogators, he described the bureaucratic paralysis that prevented strategic adaptation. "We had complete information about merchant shipping losses," he stated. Every week, reports showed more tankers sunk, more cargo vessels destroyed. Staff officers proposed using submarines to protect convoys or to attack American supply lines. These proposals never reached decision-makers. The surface fleet admirals who controlled strategy could not conceive of submarines as anything except fleet auxiliaries. The human cost of this strategic failure extended beyond submarine crews to the entire Japanese nation. Every tanker sunk meant less fuel for aircraft defending the home islands. Every cargo ship destroyed meant fewer rifles for infantry, less food for civilians, reduced industrial output across the entire economy. Meanwhile, Japanese submarines continued hunting American warships with diminishing success. The U.S. Navy had learned to protect its capital ships with sophisticated anti-submarine screening. Destroyer escorts, equipped with improved sonar and depth charges, formed multiple defensive rings around carriers and battleships. American submarines operated largely with impunity against merchant shipping while Japanese submarines struggled to even locate enemy warships, much less penetrate their defenses. I-19, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Kanashi Takakazu, achieved one of the last successful attacks against an American capital ship on September 15, 1942, torpedoing the carrier USS Wasp and the battleship USS North Carolina in a single attack. This success, celebrated in Japanese naval propaganda, reinforced the strategic doctrine even as it became increasingly irrelevant. By 1944, American carriers operated in task groups with 6 to 8 screening destroyers, aerial patrols extending 200 miles in all directions, and submarines providing distant reconnaissance. The likelihood of a Japanese submarine successfully approaching, much less attacking, an American carrier had become vanishingly small. Yet the doctrine persisted. Submarine after submarine departed on patrol with orders to seek American warships while Japanese merchant vessels burned, sank, and died throughout the Pacific. The submarines sent to attack carriers typically found nothing but empty ocean and American anti-submarine forces that were becoming increasingly efficient at their deadly work. The breaking point approached. By December 1943, Japan had lost 47 submarines since the war's beginning, approximately 27% of the submarine force. Crew losses exceeded 4,400 men. These losses had achieved minimal strategic effect. Japanese submarines had sunk 3 American carriers, damaged several battleships and cruisers, and destroyed a handful of destroyers and auxiliary vessels. In exchange, American submarines had destroyed over 40% of Japan's merchant fleet, crippled its oil supply, disrupted resource imports essential to war production, and were beginning to create actual food shortages in the home islands. The mathematics were clear: Japan was trading its submarine force for tactical successes while America was trading its submarine force for strategic victory. One nation was winning battles. The other was winning the war. February 14, 1944. 2,215 hours. Off Bougainville, Solomon Islands. Submarine I-18 wallowed on the surface, her deck loaded with drums of aviation fuel, bags of rice, ammunition crates, and medical supplies. Commander Otoji Nakamura checked his watch for the 4th time in 10 minutes. The garrison on Bougainville expected this delivery. They were starving. Without these supplies, the 40,000 troops isolated by American advances would face starvation within weeks. This was not what Commander Nakamura had trained for. He had entered submarine school in 1936 expecting to command a warship, to engage enemy vessels in combat, to bring honor to the Emperor through victory at sea. Instead, he commanded a cargo vessel that happened to submerge, running supplies to bypassed garrisons while American submarines prowled freely, destroying Japanese shipping. The supply mission, designated rat runs by Japanese planners, represented the final degradation of the submarine force's strategic role. As American advances isolated Japanese garrisons across the Pacific, submarines became the only means of supplying these stranded forces. The I-class boats, designed for fleet operations, were converted into underwater cargo vessels. The conversion requirements reduced combat capability substantially. I-18 had offloaded half her torpedoes to make room for cargo. The deck gun crew compartment had been converted to storage. The submarine could carry approximately 30 tons of supplies, but this modification increased surface profile, reduced diving speed, and made the boat more vulnerable to detection. More critically, supply runs required submarines to operate on predictable schedules to known locations, exactly the operational pattern that made them vulnerable to enemy interdiction. American intelligence, reading Japanese naval codes through the MAGIC program, often knew submarine delivery schedules before the submarines departed port. The results were predictable and tragic. I-18 completed her delivery to Bougainville on February 15. On February 17, while departing the area, she was detected by the destroyer escort USS England. The subsequent depth charge attack lasted 4 hours. I-18 sank with all hands. 104 men died delivering rice and fuel to a garrison that would surrender 6 months later. This pattern repeated across the Pacific theater. Submarines I-22, I-24, I-26, I-32, and dozens of others were converted to supply missions as American advances isolated Japanese positions. The overwhelming majority were sunk while conducting these operations. Lieutenant Commander Zenji Orita, commanding I-47, described the psychological impact in his post-war memoir, "We had become freight haulers, not warriors." Our crews, trained for years in torpedo attack and naval combat, now loaded rice bags and fuel drums. Men wept from shame. We understood the necessity, our comrades on the islands were starving. But we also understood we had become targets, not hunters. The supply missions achieved minimal strategic value at catastrophic cost. A submarine could carry 30 tons of supplies. A single merchant vessel could carry 5,000 tons. Japan was trading its most sophisticated weapons platforms, operated by its most technically trained personnel, to deliver supplies that one cargo ship could have carried in a single voyage. This resource misallocation demonstrated the complete collapse of Japanese strategic planning by 1944. Rather than concentrating remaining naval assets for decisive operations, Japan was dissipating its submarine force on supply missions that could never deliver sufficient quantities to matter. The garrison on Rabaul required 50 tons of supplies daily. Submarines could deliver, at most, 200 tons monthly, and only with unsustainable losses. By mid-1944, submarine supply operations had achieved delivery of approximately 8,000 tons at the cost of 23 submarines and over 2,000 crew members killed. Captain Takeshi Nakazawa, logistics officer at Combined Fleet Headquarters, documented the strategic insanity in his diary, recovered after his death in 1945. "We send submarines worth millions of yen, crewed by irreplaceable specialists, to deliver what a single merchantman could carry. The submarines die. The garrisons starve anyway. And still the orders continue. No one dares suggest we simply evacuate these positions. To retreat is to admit defeat, and defeat cannot be admitted until it becomes absolute." The 6th Fleet Commander, Vice Admiral Miwa, protested the supply missions in December 1943, arguing that submarines represented offensive weapons that should be concentrated for fleet operations or commerce warfare. His protest was overruled by Combined Fleet Headquarters, which prioritized symbolic supply of isolated garrisons over rational resource allocation. The crews understood they were being sacrificed for gestures rather than strategy. Morale, according to multiple post-war testimonies, collapsed during 1944. Submarine crews, previously considered elite forces, now viewed assignment to supply missions as death sentences. I-177, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Hajime Nakagawa, departed Yokosuka on September 15, 1944, loaded with supplies for Marcus Island. The crew knew the mission profile: surface approach to a known location on a predictable schedule to deliver supplies to a garrison that served no strategic purpose. They also knew that American forces controlled the surrounding waters and that detection meant death. I-177 was sunk by the destroyer escort USS Samuel S. Miles on October 3, 1944. 89 men died. Marcus Island received no supplies. The garrison surrendered at war's end, having survived without the supplies I-177 died attempting to deliver. Part 6, The Kaiten, Desperation Weaponized. August 1, 1944. Submarine Base Kure, Japan. Lieutenant Seikyo Nishina climbed into the narrow tube that would become his coffin. The Type 1 Kaiten, the name meant Turn of Heaven, measured 48 feet long and 3 feet in diameter. It was a Type 93 long lance torpedo modified to carry a human pilot who would guide it to the target in the final seconds before impact. The 3,400-pound warhead would ensure that neither the weapon nor its pilot would survive. This was the final evolution of Japanese submarine doctrine. Having failed at fleet operations and supply missions, submarines would now carry human-guided suicide torpedoes. Desperation had been weaponized. The Kaiten program emerged from the same strategic calculus that produced kamikaze aircraft. Conventional operations had failed, resources were depleted, and only sacrifice could possibly alter the war's trajectory. If Japanese submarines could not sink American ships through conventional attacks, perhaps suicide weapons could succeed where trained crews had failed. The technical development proceeded rapidly. Lieutenant Nishina and Lieutenant Hiroshi Kuroki had proposed the concept in February 1944. By August, the first weapons were operational. The Kaiten Type 1 used the Type 93 torpedo body, replacing the automatic guidance system with a small cockpit. The pilot controlled depth and direction through simple controls, aiming the weapon at targets observed through a small periscope. The weapon specifications revealed both ingenuity and desperation. Range, approximately 40 kilometers at 30 knots. Warhead, 1,550 kilograms of Type 97 explosive. Guidance, visual sighting through periscope, followed by manual steering. Crew survivability, 0 by design. Backup escape mechanism, theoretically present, never successfully used. Submarine I-47, under Commander Zenji Orita, became the first submarine modified to carry Kaiten. The modifications involved welding launch tubes to the deck, installing communication systems between submarine and Kaiten pilots, and training procedures for launching while submerged. Each submarine could carry 4 to 6 Kaiten, depending on configuration. The first operational mission departed November 8, 1944. I-47 carried 6 Kaiten and 6 pilots. The target was the American anchorage at Ulithi Atoll, where the American fleet gathered between operations. Intelligence reported dozens of carriers, battleships, and support vessels, a target-rich environment where even suicide weapons might achieve significant results. Of the 6 Kaiten launched on November 20, 1944, 1, piloted by Lieutenant Nishina himself, struck the fleet oiler USS Mississiniua, which exploded and sank with heavy casualties. The other 5 Kaiten either malfunctioned, were destroyed by defensive fire, or simply missed their targets. 5 men died achieving nothing. 1 man died sinking a support vessel. This ratio, 6 suicides to sink 1 oiler, exemplified the strategic bankruptcy of the Kaiten program. Japan was trading trained submarine officers, men whose training required years and whose experience was irreplaceable, for minimal tactical results. Yet the program expanded. By war's end, approximately 400 Kaiten had been produced. Training programs indoctrinated hundreds of young officers into suicide warfare. The volunteers came forward readily, a testament to the psychological conditioning that made death for the Emperor seem preferable to defeat. Submarine operations became focused on Caton deployment. Boats that had once hunted American carriers now served as delivery platforms for suicide weapons. The submarines themselves remained vulnerable to the same American anti-submarine forces that had been killing them for 3 years, but now they carried suicide pilots who would never return regardless of the mission outcome. The casualty figures tell the story. Of approximately 150 Caton pilots who departed on operational missions, roughly 80 were killed in action. They sank 3 American ships, the fleet oiler Mississauga, the destroyer escort USS Underhill, and the infantry landing craft LCI 600. 3 vessels destroyed at the cost of 80 trained officers who could never be replaced. Meanwhile, the submarines carrying Caton continued dying. I-36, sunk carrying Caton on April 2, 1945. I-44, destroyed with Caton aboard on April 29, 1945. I-367, lost with Caton on May 13, 1945. Each submarine loss meant approximately 100 crew deaths plus the Caton pilots, typically 4 to 6 additional casualties. Commander Makitsura Hashimoto, who commanded I-58 and survived the war, described the Caton operations in his memoir, "We had become death ships." The pilots would eat their final meal, write their final letters to families they would never see, and climb into tubes from which they would never emerge. We would launch them toward targets they might never reach. And we would wait, listening on hydrophones for explosions that usually never came. Then we would run, trying to escape American destroyers that were hunting us. The Caton pilots died for honor. We died for nothing. The program continued until war's end, consuming resources, submarines, and lives in pursuit of tactical results that could never alter strategic reality. The final Caton mission departed on August 14, 1945, 1 day before Japan's surrender. The submarine carrying them received recall orders before the weapons could be launched. The war ended with Caton pilots still sitting in their tubes, prepared to die for an empire that had already ceased to exist. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. July 15, 1945. Imperial Navy Ministry, Tokyo. Captain Atsushioi, operations analyst for the submarine force, compiled the final statistical summary that would never be officially published. The document, recovered from Navy Ministry archives after the war, represented the most comprehensive accounting of Japanese submarine operations and their catastrophic failure. The numbers documented not just military defeat but strategic catastrophe created by doctrinal rigidity and refusal to adapt. The accounting began with fleet strength. Japan had entered the war with 63 submarines operational, with another 111 completed during the conflict, for a total of 174 submarines deployed. As of July 15, 1945, approximately 16 remained operational, a survival rate of 9%. The 158 submarines lost represented not just steel and technology but the deaths of approximately 15,000 highly trained crew members, roughly 91% of all personnel who had served aboard submarines during the war. These casualties had achieved minimal strategic effect. Japanese submarines had sunk 3 American aircraft carriers, Wasp, Yorktown, and Liscum Bay. They had damaged several battleships, sunk approximately 24 destroyers and smaller warships, and destroyed roughly 40 merchant vessels. The total tonnage sunk by Japanese submarines throughout the entire war amounted to approximately 180 vessels totaling 900,000 tons, less than 1/4 of what American submarines sank in a single year. The comparison to American submarine operations revealed the magnitude of Japanese strategic failure. United States submarines, operating under Commerce Warfare Doctrine, had sunk 1,178 Japanese merchant vessels totaling 5.3 million tons, approximately 55% of Japan's entire merchant fleet. They had destroyed 214 Japanese naval vessels including 1 battleship, 8 carriers, and 11 cruisers. American submarines had strangled Japan's war economy, cutting off oil supplies, raw materials, and food imports. They had achieved strategic victory while Japanese submarines pursued tactical targets. Captain Oi's analysis identified the fundamental cause: doctrinal inflexibility. The submarine force, he wrote, was assigned a mission, fleet support, that became increasingly irrelevant as the war progressed. Requests to modify this mission, to attack enemy commerce, or to protect Japanese supply lines were repeatedly denied by commanders who could not adapt strategy to changing circumstances. We possessed excellent weapons operated by skilled crews, but employed them according to doctrine designed for a different war. The human cost extended beyond submarine crews. The merchant mariners who died aboard vessels that Japanese submarines could have protected numbered approximately 27,000. The civilians who starved as food imports ceased, the factory workers who could not produce weapons without raw materials, the soldiers who fought without adequate supplies, all represented indirect casualties of submarine strategy that ignored economic warfare while pursuing increasingly futile fleet operations. The tactical analysis revealed additional failures. Japanese submarines lacked coordinated wolfpack tactics that American submarines developed. They operated individually, unable to concentrate force against targets. Their communication procedures prioritized radio silence over tactical flexibility, preventing submarines from coordinating attacks or sharing intelligence. Their torpedo technology, initially superior with the Type 95 oxygen torpedo, proved unreliable with failure rates exceeding 20% in combat conditions. The training pipeline had collapsed by 1944. Submarine school, which had required 18 months of rigorous training before the war, had been shortened to 6 months as casualties mounted and replacement crews became necessary. These abbreviated training programs produced crews who lacked the technical proficiency and tactical knowledge of pre-war submariners. Many died on their first patrol, their training insufficient for the lethal environment they entered. The base infrastructure had been destroyed by American air attacks. Kure, Yokosuka, and Sasebo, the primary submarine bases, suffered repeated bombing raids throughout 1945. Repair facilities were demolished, fuel storage destroyed, supply depots burned. Submarines requiring maintenance often could not be repaired. Those needing fuel sometimes could not obtain it. The industrial capacity to sustain submarine operations had been systematically eliminated. Captain Oi's final assessment concluded with brutal honesty: the submarine force has been destroyed. Not primarily by enemy action, though American anti-submarine warfare proved devastatingly effective, but by strategic doctrine that assigned submarines missions they could not accomplish while prohibiting operations where they might have achieved meaningful results. We have sacrificed thousands of trained specialists, exhausted irreplaceable industrial resources, and achieved minimal impact on enemy operations. Future naval planners must understand, technology and courage mean nothing without sound strategy. We possessed both in abundance. We lacked only the wisdom to employ them effectively. This document, stamped most secret and intended only for senior Navy leadership, represented an epitaph for the Japanese submarine force. The war would end 4 weeks later. The submarines that remained would be surrendered to American forces, scrapped or scuttled. The crews who survived would carry memories of comrades lost in a campaign that had consumed nearly everyone who participated while achieving almost nothing of strategic value. August 30, 1945. Yokosuka Naval Base, Japan. Commander Makitsura Hashimoto stood on the deck of I-58, watching American naval personnel board his submarine for the final time. The war had been over for 15 days. The submarine that had survived when 158 others had perished would be scuttled by American demolition teams within the week. But first, the victors wanted to examine what they had defeated. I-58 had achieved the last significant success of the Japanese submarine force, sinking the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis on July 30, 1945, ironically, after that ship had delivered components of the atomic bomb that would end the war. Even this final success demonstrated the role chance played in submarine warfare. I-58 had stumbled upon Indianapolis by accident. The cruiser was traveling alone, unescorted, following a route that happened to intersect the submarine's patrol area. It represented opportunity, not skill, fortune, not strategy. Of the 174 submarines Japan had deployed during the war, only 16 survived to surrender. Some had been sunk in port by air raids during the war's final months. Others had been scuttled by their crews when fuel became unavailable for further operations. A handful, like I-58, remained operational only because they had been in port when surrender came. The 91% loss rate, 158 submarines and approximately 15,000 crew members killed, represented the highest casualty rate of any major naval force in World War II. The Americans cataloged everything. Technical specialists measured hull thickness, examined torpedo tubes, inspected diesel engines, analyzed communications equipment. They found submarines that were technologically sophisticated, in some ways superior to American designs, but employed according to doctrine that had rendered technology irrelevant. The most capable submarine fleet in the Pacific in 1941 had been systematically destroyed not primarily by enemy action but by strategic misemployment that made enemy action devastatingly effective. Lieutenant Commander Zenji Orita, who had survived multiple patrols and would later write one of the few first-hand accounts of Japanese submarine operations, watched the American inspection teams with mixed emotions. They studied our submarines carefully, he later wrote, trying to understand how we had lost so completely. They examined our torpedoes, our engines, our fire control systems. But they could not understand the real failure by examining hardware. The failure was not in our submarines but in how we were ordered to use them. The American submarine force had achieved what Japanese submarines could not: strategic impact. United States submarines had destroyed Japan's merchant fleet, strangled its economy, isolated its garrisons, and contributed directly to strategic victory. They had accomplished this while suffering a 22% loss rate, high by any standard, but far below the catastrophic losses Japanese submarines endured. The difference lay not in technology or courage but in doctrine. American submarines had been employed to win a war, while Japanese submarines had been employed according to traditions that prevented them from winning. The post-war interrogations of surviving submarine commanders, conducted by United States strategic bombing survey teams, revealed the psychological burden survivors carried. Commander Hashimoto, interviewed extensively about I-58's operations, described the guilt of survival. Why did I live when so many died? I-58 survived largely through fortune. Other commanders, equally skilled, equally brave, died because they encountered American forces when we did not. There was no justice in who survived and who perished. Only chance, and chance is a cruel arbiter. The families of the 15,000 submariners who died received official notification that their loved ones had died gloriously for the Emperor. They received no explanation of why these deaths achieved so little strategic value, why doctrine that failed repeatedly was never modified, why their sons and husbands and fathers had been sent on missions that became progressively more suicidal as American anti-submarine capabilities improved while Japanese submarines operated according to unchanged doctrine. The caves at Kure, where submarine crews had sheltered during air raids, contained walls covered with names inscribed by crews departing on patrol. American occupation forces, cataloging naval facilities, photographed these walls. The names represented a generation of naval officers and specialists, technically trained personnel who represented years of education and training, sacrificed in a campaign that consumed them without achieving strategic goals that might have justified the cost. The final assessment belongs to history. The Japanese submarine force entered World War II as one of the most capable underwater fleets ever assembled. It possessed technological advantages, operational experience, and numerical strength sufficient to dominate Pacific waters. It ended the war almost completely destroyed, having achieved minimal strategic impact despite catastrophic losses. The destruction resulted not from inadequacy of weapons or personnel but from strategic doctrines so inflexible it persisted despite overwhelming evidence of failure. The 91% casualty rate, the highest of any major naval force in the war, stands as permanent testimony to what happens when doctrine becomes more important than reality, when tradition prevents adaptation, and when military forces are employed according to plans that ignore the actual conditions of war they face. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.